I'll be speaking to Yasser Munif, professor at Emerson College in Boston. He teaches courses on globalization, Middle East, political economy, and he's active with the Global Campaign in Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
The ceasefire seems to have collapsed. What are your thoughts on that?
Indeed, it seems that it's the end of the ceasefire, and that's because of the failure of the different parties to reach an agreement, and that's mostly because the Syrian regime is refusing any kind of discussion of the future of Assad or any kind of negotiation around the position of the president. That's one of the main reasons. The second reason, I think, is due to the U.S. elections and the fact that Obama doesn't have much leverage anymore because everyone is waiting for the next president to be elected. And therefore, Russia and other parties are not necessarily negotiating seriously with the U.S. anymore. And therefore not putting enough pressure on Assad or other parties. And obviously the implications of that are going to be disastrous on the Syrian people.
Yeah, so there's been a bunch of bombing. I think the Times said about 24 people were killed.
Right. I mean, what's interesting with the ceasefire, or between quotation marks, because it's never been implemented, but there were some period of less intense fighting in the past few weeks. And what that showed us is that the Syrian revolutionaries and people who care about the Syrian population were actively organizing and protesting during that period when there is less fighting or the fighting is less intense. People started demonstrating and organizing not only against Assad but also against al-Nusra and other military groups. And al-Nusra was actually very nervous in the Idlib region because people stormed into their headquarters and wanted more democracy and more transparency and some kind of elections, and people were arrested and threatened and so on.
So Nusra is not as bloody. I mean, if people had tried to do this in Assad areas, he'd just mow them all down, right? I mean, Nusra is less reluctant to shoot people. Is that true?
So al-Nusra has been, that's a kind of its trademark. It's telling the Syrian people that it's not as bloody as ISIS. They have more or less the same kind of ideology, Wahhabi, globalist jihadism, and so on. But the way they have been selling it to the Syrian people is that they're more grassroots and they don't want to impose their ideology. They want people to basically embrace it. And so they are less violent and they have some room for negotiation, unlike ISIS. That doesn't mean that they are democratic, certainly not. And they've been incarcerating, killing people, assassinating people, but at a much slower or smaller rate compared to ISIS. So people are not afraid to demonstrate against them. And as I said, there were important demonstrations in the Idlib area and other, for example, the suburbs of Damascus. People were demanding for more democracy and some kind of shared decision-making and so on.
And some of these protests were quite large.
They were. And for the first time in a long time, people were using the flags of the Syrian Revolution, the secular flag, and they were using secular slogans, and activists were organizing them very actively. So that's that's been very interesting because that shows that the Syrian revolution is still alive, and there is an infrastructure for its existence despite the violence of the war and the military fighting. Once there is some kind of peace, people are willing to get out and protest and organize and so on.
So it also these protests show that the well, there's a convenient lie that there's only Assad and radical Islamists, nothing to choose from, so the world can just turn its back on that. But we see very directly that there's lots of other forces there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what's interesting with the Syrian revolution and other Arab revolution is that some people thought that Islam would bring some kind of a political ideology that would help them govern and so on. And I think it's good that people are experimenting with Islam, and it's good that Islamist groups are failing in basically in governance and in providing services to the populations. And that means that we won't have to experiment with Islam after the fall of Assad. People know it, already the significance of those extremist ideologies and the implications of that kind of Wahhabi Salafist ideology. And I think once Assad is toppled, people are not necessarily going to elect only Islamist groups. I think that the general mood in Syria is more secular, pious, secular, but not necessarily political Islam, as we saw it in other places.
Now, on the ground, of course, going to be a lot more suffering, and this year there's been a lot of attention about starvation in Syria, first in Madaya and then in other towns and areas. The area that I saw as having the worst, I'm probably not going to pronounce it right, Daraya, is that how you say it?
Daraya, yeah.
Daraya, and they're in very bad shape.
Right. I mean, the Syrian regime has always used the bread, as a symbolic, commodity to discipline the population even before the Syrian revolution. But after the Syrian revolution started in 2011, bread became one of the main weapons that the Syrian regime has been using against the Syrian population, either to starve the population or, for example, they've been bombing entire fields of wheat, destroying silos, and so on, to starve the population. As one of the tactics, basically to defeat the opposition and undermine any possibilities of an alternative society or alternative political system in the liberated areas. And it's been very effective. I mean, when you starve people, obviously, either they surrender to some of the extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam, or they are defeated and their region are conquered and occupied by the Syrian regime. So the situation is extremely difficult, and starvation has been used since day one by the Syrian regime.
And then we've also heard about Yarmouk camp. I did an interview with Nidal Batari a little while ago, and he's talking about Assad helping ISIS against Nusra to take over the ruins of Yarmouk.
Right. I mean, also that's been one of the strategies of the Syrian regime, and I'm not necessarily, I don't think it's a conspiracy theory, but rather a convenient kind of non-agreement between ISIS and the Syrian regime. Both of them have interest in defeating the opposition, mostly the secular opposition, but also part of the Islamist opposition, because that means that they're providing only two options. So for the West, Assad wants to tell the West that the only option, if the Syrian regime falls, is ISIS. that's why the Syrian regime is interested in ISIS taking over territories such as Al Yarmouk and other places. And ISIS is also interested in the Syrian regime crushing the Syrian opposition because that also sends a signal that the Syrian population should join ISIS to defeat this brutal dictator. So they both have an interest in defeating the opposition, and that's what's been happening in many, many places, and most recently in Al Yarmouk, unfortunately.
So now here's the big question. What should we be saying? People who are sympathetic or the left in the United States, however you want to describe it, what are the slogans and demands people should be making now?
I think, first of all, we should think about the long term. Clearly, the Syrian revolution and the Arab revolts more generally are going to last for long periods, and we should also be able to perceive what's happening beyond the chaos and the messiness of what's happening on an everyday basis. And that means that there is still a revolutionary spirit in Syria and beyond, and that those people should be our allies. And so this revolutionary spirit materializes in different ways, but it's still present. I mean, the doctors, the people who are rescuing, the people who are involved in the relief work, the teachers, and so on, in addition to the media activists and other activists, should be our ally. And we should, as much as we can, try to create networks and connections with those people. Mm-hmm. So I think this is one of the most important points. The second point is insist on ending the siege of entire neighborhoods, entire cities, entire regions, because it's been devastating, as you know. The third point, I think, is the question of the political prisoners. We don't have a very accurate estimate, but there are at least 90,000, maybe 100,000 or more political prisoners, and oftentimes they're tortured, and many of them are killed in prison. And there are many activists and many groups who are working on those issues, so we can, again, highlight their struggle and make connections with them. And the question of refugees is also very important, and I think we should avoid the humanitarian kind of perspective that those are people who need help and need support. Instead, I think we should politicize the question and also look at it as a community of people rather than individuals. So one of the problems with the refugees is oftentimes, the international organization treat them as individuals. I think it's important for leftist and progressive groups to politicize their question and treat them as a collectivity. And that means they have a right to their language, to their culture, and political rights in the places where they live. And finally, oppose any kind of foreign intervention or presence in Syria. And that includes, obviously, US, Qatar, and Turkey, but oftentimes the left forgets about Iran and Russia and the militias from Iraq and Afghanistan and others.
And those forces are much more powerful, of course, than anything that was put in on the other side.
Until recently, Iran has sent only the Revolutionary Guard, but more recently we learned that they're sending the army. The Iranian army is now present in Syria. So the left is often reluctant to denounce the Iranian and the Russian presence for geopolitical reasons that I don't really understand, but I think it's important to denounce all type of foreign intervention, including Iran and Russia.
Well, this has been really good, and I hope we'll talk again. Thank you for talking.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.